Welcome, everyone, to the third episode of the Two Words podcast, the podcast with my friend Dan Hartley and myself, Juan Zapardiel. How are you doing, Dan?
Very well, Juan. How are you doing upstairs?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. Dan is right. We are at the same house, our house, for the first time since we started the podcast, and it won't be for very long, because I think I'm going to be on the move next weekend as well. So you can start to see why we decided to do this in online instead of in person.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, no, it's exciting. We're hitting the third episode now. That's it's moving forward. We've started all the channels, started seeing some engagement on those channels. So excited to dive in. We have some exciting topics, I think, this week. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, Dan, I think we can start just by mentioning this topic that you just brought up. Yeah, so starting something is sometimes can feel very complicated, and we have certainly faced an element of that when starting the podcast. I remember we were talking, I was back in Madrid, and we were talking on the car, and I used this analogy of static friction and dynamic friction, which for some of the engineers in the audience, they will be able to recognize essentially friction is proportional to a coefficient and to the normal force to the surface, right? And it turns out that the static friction coefficient is much higher than the dynamic friction coefficient. Actually, let me put this to the test. We're improvising a bit here, but if I can show you this. So I'm going to go and grab a pen. I'm coming, Dan, I'm coming.
All good.
Just bear with me. Okay, so um, I hope everyone can see that pen over there. As I said, the static friction is higher than the dynamic friction. That means then that when I try to move the pen like this, I only move one side. See? And you can try at home with a pen yourselves. When you try to move a pen, you only move with one finger. Anyway, this is a bit of a long-winded explanation to come to the point that I feel that with many things in life, when you're starting a new project, it can feel a bit like that, where putting things in motion takes much more energy than getting things rolling once things have already kickstarted. Yeah, I don't know, Dan, if you wanted to add anything to this.
No, I mean, yeah, I think Juan, as you've said, is exactly right, right? I think it's a great analogy because it is so simple and it's great, the example with the pen because it is really great to understand in terms of why people don't fall when they're climbing, in terms of the importance of static and dynamic friction, but it's more a philosophical point as well of actually how important it is to get started and how much more work that takes for habits, even friendships and relationships. It's always more effort getting to know someone, to trust them, than to go grab a coffee after 3 years of being of knowing that person, or even taking that step that people are scared to do, if that's pursuing their dream job or moving countries. It's that's always been a point that I've always thought is important, and the quicker you can get past that, it's it's amazing. Really, you can get things moving and then keep it moving, and I think that's a great thing about us. Now we're at episode 3. We're gonna keep it rolling. The hard part was, how do we create a TikTok? How do we create a Spotify podcast? So that's great. Also have a fun fact for you, Juan. I don't know if you know this, but the actual person who discovered this sort of sliding friction, as it was known then, and why was it different to something that was stationary, was actually Leonardo da Vinci originally in 1493. So then it got rediscovered in this just before the 1700s, but originally there were elements of that in play when you looked at some of his engineering work. So yeah, it's a little fun fact for the audience there as well.
Well, thanks for that historical fact. While you were saying that, I was thinking as well, it was potentially rediscovered a third time as well, even today's age, with this analogy by James Clear in his book Atomic Habits. I don't think that book needs a plug. I just have the feeling that everyone on planet Earth has now read that book. It's a great book if you haven't read it. But one of the concepts that James Clear points out in his book is this idea of friction reduction, where to build better habits, you need to reduce friction. So basically, it's this idea that the easier it is to perform an action, the more likely we are to do that constantly.
Absolutely, I agree. So should we dive right in?
Yeah, let's move on. So we have a couple of topics on the agenda for today. Um, it is January, and so let's start there. January has set the mark for a lot of employees at corporate giants like JP Morgan, like Amazon, I think AT&T as well. Dan, you work at a large corporate, so you can also tell us your view and the policies that are being applied there. The point is, for many across the world, January also marked the date where mandatory 5-day return to office policies started. And I just wanted to have an open discussion about this. I am of the thinking that that is a losing strategy. I actually think that it is emblematic of other broken areas of your business, like people processes, like having a low performance culture, low trust. Ultimately, yeah, it comes down to this lack of trust in employees. So much so that corporate mom and dad need to come and impose a curfew on their employees. So, Dan, I wanted to get your views first on this return to office policies as well. We have been hearing, and I've been reading up on some of the news here, and it seems like it's also been a bit chaotic where offices weren't prepared to take on that volume of employees, literally everyone in the company returning back to the office. And we've heard stories of full parking lots, of no desks, no meeting rooms, even desk theft, I've read as well. So yeah, I just wanted to first maybe get your view, Dan, on this topic, and as well what sorts of policies you have at your company.
Yeah, absolutely, Juan. So I think first of all, at a bigger point, which is we've kind of gone from one extreme to another extreme on a pendulum, is the way I see it. So we've gone from a COVID era where we suddenly had literally people not in the office at all. And then slowly over time, we've kind of had a hybrid system. And now we've seeing in some companies, not all, but yes, like you said, Amazon, for example, and JP Morgan, we have seen hitting the other side of the pendulum, which is we're going to now really reinforce this and track this in terms of these 5-day working. And it has been chaotic. And that Business Insider article that you're, I think, referring to there about Amazon, and that is, I can relate to, and I'll get to that in a second in terms of some of those things, having working in a big corporate. But I don't think it is, and I agree with you there, Juan, in terms of the overall strategy going forwards. I think, however, rather than saying everybody should be going in XYZ days a week or some sort of hybrid culture, depending where people are based and different cultures, how you, I guess, focus on a different HR strategy to tailor it to those cultures and individuals in large companies and large corporates with offices around the world. I think it's a much more complex discussion. And I think in particular, I think there are reasons that are very rational in terms of bringing people together in a 5-day a week environment, such as innovation and collaboration. However, only when that is actually done properly and in the right team dynamics. In a lot of cases, and most cases, but by far the majority of cases, I would say that that actually doesn't apply. So I think that actually what we're seeing is that, for example, in Amazon, a lot of people are going back and they're confused because they're taking meetings from virtually within the office rather than getting a meeting room because the meeting rooms are full. And this is something I've experienced personally. So at work, we had a not very enforced hybrid working model where we've actually then put in much more kind of restrictive policies where it's like at least 2 days a week. And in some teams, that is actually more. And in some offices, there are different levels of enforcement of those policies. And what we saw was that when people who were, who lived outside of London and didn't want to commute in, so they'd come in every 2 weeks for a few days, they started coming in a lot more frequently. And suddenly we saw this sort of issue with suddenly there wasn't enough desk space, there wasn't enough simple things like there's fruit that's free in the canteen. That just basically by after 1 or 2 hours, it was completely empty because you suddenly had a huge influx of people. And I did actually have an experience multiple times workplace theft where people would literally steal other people's spots because you'd gone to a meeting and you'd forgotten to put a jacket down or something along those lines. Not me personally, so it is a thing because there's just no space, and that's an interesting problem because effectively these companies have tried to cut down on costs and office space to be able because of this hybrid model, but now they're enforcing something with a limited office space, so then it doesn't quite add up, and it's a really interesting discussion. I think, though, my bigger point would be that the reason that it's so important in the future that the hybrid model exists is to actually retain talent, to drive work life balance, um, an element of cost savings, and people having the opportunity to do various different other things, right? So, in Spotify, for example, they have this policy of work from anywhere. So people would love to travel and work from Bali whilst at the same time experiencing the hustle and bustle of a major city. That is for young professionals, at least. That's what a lot of the statistics that I've been seeing. And in a place like London, we also want the commute time savings and the money savings, right? We're talking about over £1,000 in commuting a year, a huge amount of time spent with commuting. It's around approximately 74 minutes a day that people spend in terms of getting to that place of work in London, so and back. So that's a lot of time lost that you could be using either to work harder or to stay at home.
Especially in
And
a big metropolis like London, where
absolutely,
and with the crazy rent prices that we're seeing, everything is really at an all-time high when it comes to property and rent. That
absolutely,
just people, like, the mathematics just don't add up. Like, there's not enough property, and the property is so expensive that not everyone that works in the big, in the city center can live in the city center. So that's why you have this big metropolis in London where everything that, like, I always have the mental rule that if you want to take public transport in London from our house in South London, but in other places as well, it's always going to take you upwards of an hour, right?
yeah,
And if you
yeah,
add that up, an hour of commute to the office, an hour of commute back, and it's not only that, it's then you really have these inefficiencies. Like, you need to pack your things, you get to the office, you do all the small talk with everyone, then you leave, you need to say goodbye to everyone. Then you need to, for example, I bike I need to go find a bike, right? Um, and it's just, again, there's a lot of friction between getting to work and coming back from work, that in the end, you add up the hour of commute, the hour back, plus the, let's say, another 45 minutes to another hour of in between friction, that everything adds up, and in the end you're losing 3 hours a day every day that you're going to the office. And these 3 hours are critical for some people that are that have a family, those 3 hours are the time that they are spending on keeping up with their work-life balance. And it is okay to lose those 3 hours for some of the advantages that you were pointing out. It's undeniable. In-person working will never be replaced with online video calls for things like mentorship, things like innovation, brainstorming, the spontaneous collaboration that can take place in person. I agree, cannot be replaced. Now, is the answer 5 days mandatory back to office? There is where I disagree. There's much more nuances in that, and I do think that some of the companies that are now enforcing these policies will see the backlash from it. And actually, it has been said that maybe these policies are a form of silent layoffs from some of these, big corporations that just have too many people and that don't want to pay the price to take them out. And I can tell that, that is really not how you should do layoffs, especially because the people that are going to leave in these situations are typically the good people that you don't want them to leave, right? They're the people that are good people that have the skills that are employable, whereas the people that wouldn't have it so easy to take up a new job or get selected for a new job, they are the ones that are going to stay. Okay, but I'll take it one step further. I just think that these policies are just a symbol of very low trust in your employees. Trust and accountability with your employees. And now those two really go hand in hand. Actually, there's another third pillar that is very important. So let's think about it in this way. The first pillar is trust with your employees, right? That's the foundation of hybrid work. It is acknowledging that your employees are adults, right? And that they are capable of managing their time and delivering results irrespective of location. Now, if that doesn't hold true and you cannot trust your employees, then your problem is much greater than a location issue. That's why I said at the beginning, it's emblematic of bigger issues within the firm, like hiring, performance culture, talent processes in general. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar is measuring output and impact instead of just plain input, right? So, of course, when you have a system that is based on trust, it can sometimes be abused. And that is why you really need a performance culture, which is central to operating in a high trust environment, where your employees must have clear goals, clear performance indicators, and a regular feedback loop, that they know what is expected of them and they can be held accountable for the results that they deliver, right? It's being results driven, not input driven, which in this case is plain present, which just, makes no sense. And the third pillar, and maybe a minor point, is it is very important to have clear transparency and share calendars. And that is because when you have a hybrid model, because we said that there are some fundamental advantages to working in person, to be able to preserve that and for people to plan in advance, you need to have a lot of transparency so that people can find the time and plan effectively around in-person collaboration. So again, it's those three pillars. One is having trust in your employees, treating them as adults. Two, it's measuring output and impact instead of plain input, aka presence in this case. And 3 is having transparency around calendars. And actually, let me pull some stats here as well, because I've heard a lot of opinions around hybrid models and the future of work. Should it be in person? Should it be remote? I think that clearly the virtue is somewhere in the middle. And a lot of people, even in person advocates, like Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, some of these CEOs that were raised in that era where it was just in person, there was no other option. Well, even some are now coming out and saying, well, actually, when I think from my upbringing and how I was taught, in person is better. And some people can think that. We've outlined the advantages. But the data doesn't support me. The data doesn't support my view. And what is some of that data? Well, I think there's, again, 3 fundamental bullet points here. 1, you correctly touched on. Companies that offer hybrid model work policies will see less employee churn. And that is, in some cases, a game changer for companies. And it's not only employee churn, but it's also absenteeism, right? Point number 2 is that actually the data supports that hybrid model workers are more productive. And some of the reasons for that are that you don't lose the time on the commute, which you can use for work. Actually, one of the directors in my business the other day said a phrase that was, the good thing about consulting is that you can work from wherever. And the bad thing about consulting is that you can work from wherever. Well, it turns out that a McKinsey survey done in 2023 showed that 87% of respondents indicated that they would be more productive if they worked their desired number of days at home than if they had to work in the office 5 days a week, right? So that's the second point. And the third point is much more philosophical even, where I really want to think that the future of work is human-centric. And for me, just like thinking from first principles, it just makes sense that if an employee is treated with trust and is accountable to deliver the results, they should be able to work in a way that works with them.
Absolutely. No, I mean, Juan, I totally agree. And I think those are some great statistics and ways of breaking it down. I think it's a very, very important part. I think touching on just really one thing that you mentioned, I just like to highlight and really get into is a bit more is, I mean, the reality is we're in a hybrid working world, right? A huge event, COVID-19 happened. We were kind of moving towards this direction already, but this is the reality of the world we work in. And forcing a 5-day working week for especially young talent is not going to work. We've seen statistics. Trip.com, for example, did an analysis of their workforce, and they came to the conclusion that including hybrid working actually improved retention rates of their talent by 33%. So it is not something that is going to leave
Yeah, that's
anytime
not
soon.
surprising.
It's not surprising at all. And I think we both come from that perspective of it's good to have hybrid because we know that our jobs don't require a very intensely collaborative environment every single day. And that's where, like you said, you can focus on mentorship and collaboration in office, and you can do that through transparency and trust. And the trust aspect of that empowerment, I think, really helps people feel more content with their jobs, and the flexibility, right, of geographically, but also time wise. If you're able to be cooking while you're sorting something out at work or doing some of those chores that you had to do on the weekend, that can actually really boost, or that evening actually, that's actually really powerful for an employee because it suddenly gives them that extra bit of freedom and ability to spend a little more time at work, or even work a bit longer because they're already at home, right? And they know that dinner's going to be served in 20 minutes and they can work till that point in time rather than having to commute for an hour. So I think those are some really, really important things to consider. And I know that in I would be surprised if our company brought a 5 day working week, and I don't think it would work well. I think it would be counterproductive. And one of the main reasons is talent retention, because people will go to companies which are enforcing and trusting their employees. And I think the trust aspect is fundamental, because without trust, you can't get anywhere. You can't make anything happen. So if you don't feel trusted, you're not going to be happy. It's quite simple.
Right. Yep. So I think it's clear employees want to be treated as what they are, adults. They want to be held accountable for results and not input. And they want to have a way to blend in work with their life in a way that they feel is more productive. Not everyone's life is exactly the same to their peer. And just allowing that degree of freedom to adapt around their life is game changing, and I do think that it will backfire. It's just a matter of time when the bill will come due. Okay, so I think we can move on from this topic. If you don't mind, one of the other topics that I wanted to bring here today, just to get your views on this, I had a friend reach out to me this week and ask me for advice because they were thinking about moving jobs. Now, they're a very good friend of mine. They have a, very well-paying job, very comfortable job, and they, you know, this person was thinking about moving jobs within the firm because they didn't like their manager, and they wanted to switch it up a bit. They had been working that job for 4 years, and this new job aligned a lot better with their passion. Right. Let's leave aside the fact that giving advice on this sort of topic is quite sensitive, and we can maybe talk about how you can navigate this. But but on top of this, what makes this a trade-off instead of an easy decision is that this person was very comfortable at their job. Their manager was not very demanding. They had full flexibility in their working hours and, location-wise as well. And they were halfway through to getting a promotion. Now they were looking to move within the firm to a different team that is lower priority within the company, and that it is much more intensive, longer hours, less pay, not by a lot. Again, they were paid quite well at their previous job, but it does align better with their passion. What do you do in this case? So on two fronts. One, how do you advise a person that is coming up to you with this question? Maybe you can help me out a bit here. And the second question is, what would you actually tell them, and what would you do in their situation?
Absolutely, Juan. So I think this is a debate and a discussion that a lot of people face, especially in their early careers, because the reality is, no matter what you think you're getting yourself into, the realities of a workplace are very different to anything you've experienced coming out of an education system. And I think the realities of those can be both great and bad, and it's very complex, and it has a lot to do with not only with the work, but also relationship, including what you said about a manager, for example, right? And I think as a general, I think there are two ways that I'd look at it, and it's based on your contextual environment. And again, right, advice in this area is a case by case basis, and it needs to consider every single aspect of your life. But I think basically, broadly, it has to do with your personality and your environment that you're already in, right? And I think it's either for dreamers, you should pursue your passion. It's a bold move, but it can lead to a lot of fulfillment. but it requires a lot of strategic planning, right? Which sometimes dreamers can lack. And some of these things include saving money, building the right connections, being ready for setbacks, because that's something that some dreamers might miss. And
What do you what do you mean when you say dreamers?
right. So when I say dreamers, what I mean is there are different views on how people look at different situations, right? So you have a
Is it a
sort of,
personality trait or a
it's a
personality
personality
type?
trait. Exactly. But it's not necessarily the personality types that you might think of like as a test, but rather how you behave in certain situations. So we're talking about, for example, regret is a big area, and people view regret in different ways. And one of the things that keeps people in, for example, stable jobs is they're trying to minimize their regret in terms of thinking about losing a potentially stable career, which leads to a stable income, where dreamers might actually not be too not think too much about their regret, right? So they might think more about actually what is the highest possible payoffs or the most risk neutral perspective. So it's a risk profile as well. So they might
Okay.
focus on actually how can I actually do what I want to do, feel fulfilled, and financially meet my goals. That's how I would describe a dreamer.
Okay,
And that's
so that's interesting because I would have expected, like, okay, so I see dreamers as the type of people that are somehow delusional optimists. That's
okay.
sometimes those types of people are really the ones that make it because for some things in life you just need to be a delusional optimist. And it's tied to your risk profile as well, because those types of personalities are much more tolerant to risk. And in some cases, you just have to take massive risk in order to get massive payoff as well. And so that's why some of the very successful entrepreneurs, like the Elon Musks of the world, like who could also be a delusional optimist. I mean, Elon Musk is the absolute representation of a delusional optimist. Steve Jobs as well was a good example of this. There are people that are willing to take very high risks in order to get very high returns as well. And then on the contrary, I would see people that are much more calculated, if that's a word, pragmatic as well, where it's those people that are much more down to earth and thinking things through and looking at how they can minimize their risk profile, much more conservative, looking at how they can minimize their risk profile to get okay returns, right? But anyway, I interrupt
Yeah.
your stream of thought.
No, no, of course, Juan. So, yes, I would broadly agree. I think the way I see it is more binary, though, because I think it's more you're either a dreamer or you are a realist. I don't think, in terms of my bucketizing of the type of recommendation I would give, right? Which is
Right.
stay with your current job or move, because that's the only real advice. Or the third option is do something else. But in
Mm-hmm.
that situation, that's how I would look at it. And absolutely, my other bucket, as you've rightly mentioned, is realists and people who focus on stability and growth and think about a calculated, strong foundation to pursue their dreams later on, for example, and reduce their risk profile. Now, the way I see it though is more that dreamers are actually not necessarily a Steve Jobs, which is like literally one extreme, who is happy to spend 10 years working away at something and hoping that it becomes a big business rather than somebody who kind of joins a, for example, startup, which is Series B or C. So it's already done quite well for itself and it hasn't gone bust yet, or a company that's about to IPO, right? I think those would still be
Right.
dreamers. Again, I do see your point. I think what I meant more was just how do people actually, what do they care about more? Right? In terms of internally, if you had to choose one of the two things, most people actually in our generation seem to care more about what satisfies them at work, what gives them satisfaction than remuneration. And that means that to an extent, a lot of people would be in my category dreamers. but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to cure cancer. 70% of millennials prioritize meaningful work over salaries, right? So, as an example.
But it's not
So that's
only
what I'm
salary,
thinking
right?
about. No, not
It's
at
not,
all.
because in this case, it would be also sacrificing work-life balance, actually. So
Absolutely.
it's a double hit. You're taking a hit on the salary, and you're also taking a hit on the work-life balance front, where currently you're in a very comfortable position, your manager is not very demanding, but inherently because of that, your work is also not very motivating. But
Yeah.
you have a lot of time, you have a great work-life balance, you can really do whatever you want. So yeah, I think we should also not forget that when we give some of these examples of dreamers, I just want to be careful that we don't romanticize it too much, because there's a degree of confirmation bias that we can just not deny here, where we talk about the Elon Musks of the world, we talk about Steve Jobs, and maybe to the people listening, they can be thinking, well, who doesn't want to be like Steve Jobs, right? The problem with this is we don't know all the people that tried and stayed in and that didn't succeed, because just inherently because they didn't succeed, we just don't know about them, right? So I just wanted to make that caveat. The other point is around, okay, so how do you really make a decision like that? And this is actually what I, in the vein of what I told my friend when they approached me, was I said, look, you are the only person that can make the necessary trade-offs to make a decision. And me, as in this case, it's actually very similar to consulting. So as a consulting partner, I can only provide a framework for you to make a decision. And that decision should be made based on very good due diligence to gather all the facts, look at all the pros, look at all the cons, quantify each and every factor, what is going to change. And once you have all the facts laid down, if you're still driven to make that change, even after knowing I'm going to be working 30% more at this job, I'm foregoing, I don't know, £20,000 in salary to make this jump into this other job. And still, after seeing that in front of you, ideally even written down with your own handwriting on a sheet of paper, if you still think that you should make the jump, then you really, it's the decision made, right?
Yeah, I think,
And go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say, so I agree. I think on a wider point, right? I think the question is really, do the risks that you're going to take by moving outweigh the potential rewards? And what I mean by that is what you define as risk and what you define as reward, because it's not just financial, right? Mental health, you rightly mentioned, you could be taking on a lot more stress in this new job from everything you've captured. But also there's a risk in inherently staying in a job that you might find less fulfilling, right? So it's not so straightforward to come to these answers. And I definitely agree. I think the best thing to do is think about that. Think about your career growth and skills. If you stayed in your current job, will you get more mentorship? Will you actually be able to move some of your skills forward to become more valuable, to get more networks, to get an even better job in the future that you really want? Or also the failure rate, right? Is the current area you're in going to exist in 5 years' time? Is the area you're going to move to going to exist in 5 years' time? What are the kind of risk areas? Is it based on how good of quality work you actually produce that leads to the success of that area of a business? I think those are some of the things one needs to consider. And I agree. Then you need to make a decision. I think some people struggle and might end up in the category of still, I don't know, even when they've done this exercise and thought through all of the options and asked ChatGPT to give them a comprehensive overview. And I think that's where I like to use a trick when I've made big decisions, which is flipping a coin. And rather than flipping a coin in the sense of 50-50, what you do is you flip a coin and you say heads is this, tails is that. And if you get a tails and you feel happy or relieved, or you feel disappointed and angry or sad or scared, that tells you what the decision is. So I think that's also something to consider, because even
Right.
when you've put all the facts on the table, we humans are great at making thousands of subconscious decisions. So actually using that to your advantage when you're stuck can actually also be a useful measure. But I'm not sure, Juan, what your thoughts are and what your advice was or is to that person.
Right. So actually, you bring up some interesting points. So my advice is can be broken down into different fronts. Number one is that you need to get the facts straight. Right. You need to understand exactly what the conditions are before you sign the contract. Now, the catch to that is that humans, we're actually very bad at making multi-factor decisions, especially when we need to give weighting to different factors. Because in this case, you could lay the factors down, and if you were a machine, it would be very easy to come up with an algorithm in a way that you would give a rating from, let's say, 1 to 5 of how important it is to you that you lose, that you forego on salary. How important it is for you from 1 to 10 that your motivation in your work is going to increase. How important it is that your work-life balance increases or decreases. And if you give the weighting to those elements and then you multiply them out, and you did this really empirically, you would end up with a numerical solution that if you were a machine, it would work 10 out of 10 times. The reality is that every time that I have either tried that myself or tried that method with other people, it fails 10 out of 10 times. And the reason is because we as humans are very bad at giving weightings at those different elements, at trying to attach a numerical value to the importance that an element may have over another one. Because in a great majority of cases, there is just one factor that is better when you have two options, and everything else is worse, but that one factor just is weighted so disproportionately highly against those other options that is what is going to be the decision maker. And sometimes when you try to do this empirically, we're just afraid to admit that that is the factor that makes all the difference. Right? So that is piece of advice number one. Piece of advice number two is when you're young, and I've experienced this myself as well, the number one piece of advice that I've heard and that I could give is fail fast. Learn how to fail. Do things, say yes to everything. Fail, learn, stand up, go to the next thing, fail again, right? And in this case, the fundamental piece of advice that I could give is prioritize learning over everything else. When you're young, a 5K, even a 20K boost in salary sometimes doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, right? Not always. Sometimes it depends on the context. Sometimes that will be life-changing. But in some other cases, and in most cases, when you're young, that doesn't matter as much as the compound growth that you get from the learning experience, exposing yourself to new experiences in a way that just when you're, let's say, 50 years old, it makes all the difference because it has compounded over time.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with that. I think one of the main things you can do and the best things that you can do when you're young is to learn. And the only way to learn is to make mistakes and to fall flat on your face and to get back up again. And I know where from people that I know who've attended, for example, senior management training, right? So they've gone to CEO, CFO Connects, where they've been trained up by great, basically, coaches, right? So, for example, there was this one case where someone I know went to a training session held by the rugby coach for the English team, and he asked, "How many of you guys have failed more than 7 times, 8 times, 10 times, 12 times in something really, really important in your life?" Right? So trying to get your job you really wanted, trying to get into the university you really wanted, a relationship that never worked out, these sorts of things. The people who were the most successful in that room were the ones correlated with the most amount of failures. So basically, they got back up, they wiped the dirt off their skin, and they kept going. And that is a very, very important aspect to consider when it comes to your career and building a personality. Because if you can't overcome anything, then nothing will stop you from trying what you've put your head towards. Is one way of viewing it, right? It's obviously there's more to it, but that's at least a philosophy that I've always taken. And throw yourself into something, try something new, and if it works out, great. And if it doesn't, then you learn something, and that's it, and move on to the next thing.
Yeah, so actually, you've sprung a thought in my mind because I went to one of these, leadership training sessions with executives, and there's an external coach provider that you go there for a day and they teach you about all these different skills. I think my course was about influencing skills.
Okay.
If I knew the name of the provider, I would say it because I really enjoyed the course and I would promote it 100%. But it just reminded me of this because so one thing happened at that training session that is really telling of what you were just describing, which is that there was a very senior executive at that training session, chairman of the board of a multi-billion-dollar company. And they asked him a similar question around how do you feel in your day-to-day life? How many times have you failed, etc.? And he came up and said, well, actually, I still have this feeling to this day. He was, again, very senior, 60 years old probably, and so in his 60s, senior executive. And he said, to this day, I feel like someone is going to come to the room and realize that I'm faking it and kick me out of the room. And so if the chairman of the board of a company feels like that, I just think that it's normal to feel that imposter syndrome when you're trying new things. Anyway, I want to move on from this topic, Dan. I think that there were a few other topics that we wanted to briefly touch. I know you wanted to touch on these health and on these health metric apps and devices that are becoming quite popular now. I have a strong opinion about it, so I'm looking forward to see what you have to say, and then I'll say what I think.
Absolutely, Juan. So one of the topics we wanted to touch on for the audience was something that's gotten really big, especially in London, and it's gotten big around the world as well, is these sorts of health metric gadgets, health metric apps. So there's this thing called the Whoop band, for those who don't know. It's this wraparound band that, similar to, it looks a bit like a Fitbit, and it measures over 300-400 different metrics, all things from sleep to different inconsistencies in your heart rate, so many more. And it's similar to an Apple Watch or some of these Garmin devices that exist. And there's also something similar to it called the Aura Ring, which I'm not sure if you know, Juan.
I hadn't heard of it.
It's a ring for tracking your sleep, basically. So there are a lot of...
Okay.
So it's gotten very big in the US, and it's a big thing
Rings a
about
bell.
they're increasingly popular tools for tracking and improving everybody's health and fitness. But the question is actually how useful they are. I am personally quite interested in staying healthy, making sure I get my 8 hours of sleep. I've read books on sleep. I do a lot of sports, and so these were areas that I've always found quite interesting. But At the same time, there are some fundamental of questions of, for example, if my sleep quality is bad tonight, is that something actually useful as a piece of information? Because I
Right.
inherently would have known, oh, my sleep schedule's slightly off because I've been out for dinner or stayed up slightly late. And these are some of the things that I wonder at what point do these things actually become not productive, but actually counterproductive. For example, creating stress and anxiety around when you go to sleep rather than just falling asleep. And I think that was something that I found quite an interesting discussion. And maybe, Juan, maybe you wanted to give your piece of opinion, and I have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I was really hoping that you would come from the other side and tell me that these devices are marvelous and put the pieces together so that I can see what I'm missing. But I think you're more in the same opinion as me. I have quite a few friends that have come to me to try to either convince me of getting one or just plainly asking me for my opinion on it and if they should get one. For example, my girlfriend Blanca, she has for some time been asking me if she should buy one. Again, in the end, it's her decision, similar to the previous discussion that we were having. So I can only give my thoughts. But then in the end, she ended up buying one, so I guess it didn't serve for much. In any event, my point here is, so I'm sorry if I'm missing something, and if someone that is listening has a different opinion here, please let us know. I really see these gadgets like the Whoops of the world, these health apps and metrics apps, and it's not only tied to health. This can also apply to a lot of ideas that are great in theory, on paper, but that it is much harder to extract the expected value in the real world. And I'll explain. I really see why you would want to track all of these health metrics, get all the graphs, the indicators, historical data, you get all the charts, you can implement AI. It just sounds really cool as an idea. And it is one of those things that if asked in isolation and again on paper, you wouldn't say no. Like, would you like to monitor key health and fitness metrics based on empirical sensor data? Well, you would probably say yes. But if you think about it, at the end of the day, you have a sensor on your wrist that is tracking your heart rate, maybe a sensor that is tracking your blood's oxygen levels. Again, I'm not too familiar with exactly how it works. And then from there, you get bombarded with all of these permutations of the same data in different shapes and forms, like your stress levels, your recovery, your sleep score, I think it gives you as well, which in most cases are just a form of delivering back your heart rate to you, I find. Or, exactly like you said, just delivering back how many hours of sleep you had last night. So my question with all of these things, and this is what I told my girlfriend as advice when I was trying to influence her to not buy this device. I guess I didn't do a very good job. I should probably attend the training session again. My question is always, so what? You have a recovery score of 56. Okay, so what? You slept 6 hours and 56 minutes yesterday, and it's cool, like you have a graph and you can tell that 2 hours of those 6 hours and 56 minutes were REM sleep. Okay, so what? So in my view, it's not actionable. It's cool data, and I'm an engineer and a management consultant, so I love a good graph. But yeah, I just don't see much point. And then on top, they're charging you $200 a year in subscription on top of the device itself, which I just think is ridiculous. I don't know, it just strikes me like the kind of business that will have a lot of early traction as they inundate the market with advertisement, and then it's the new gadget around the block. people start looking at it. There's a lot of advertisement. There's probably a lot of VC money behind it. I haven't checked if they're bootstrapped or VC backed. I would think that there's a lot of VC money behind a product like that because of the business model. But I would bet that they have a high customer churn as people slowly realize that they, like you said, they don't need an app to tell them that they're tired. I was telling Blanca, I was like, well, I'm the best version of any Whoop or Fitbit or whatever device that you can get, because when I wake up, I know if I've had a good night's sleep. I know if I'm tired. I know if I need time to recover or if today I don't feel like going to the gym. I don't need, to get a stupid score on a screen. But anyway, I think unless you want to add something, I think there's not much point to keep discussing because I think we're both on the same page.
I think there's one more thing. So I
Okay.
agree. I think the one thing I would say, and this is where I take it as a more bigger approach, because I use a Apple Watch, and everybody in my family does use some sort of smartwatch. The reason that I find that is actually quite useful, and there have been studies on this, is that it actually promotes physical activity. So actually having a watch that forces you to get your steps in and tells you a step count actually
Right.
helps people overall be healthier. And I think that's really important across age groups. So that's really, really useful. And it can drive a behavioral change, right? So getting a notification
Okay.
saying, hey, you're not doing much can actually help. Coming back to our static and dynamic friction conversation, it can actually get people moving, pun not intended, but basically getting people moving in the right direction. And that's really useful. And the last one actually is, I agree
So
with
it's
the
like a placebo, right? Almost.
exactly. It is because
Okay.
then
Interesting.
there's a social element as well. And don't
So
get
you're
me wrong,
paying $200 for a placebo.
exactly.
Okay.
And proving to other people that you're sporty, so you become sporty, sort of situation.
Right.
But I
Okay. Like the
think
Stravas of the world as well.
exactly like a Strava, but I wouldn't buy a Whoop. I think it's way too expensive. I don't like the subscription model. With my Apple Watch, I bought it, and therefore that's it. No more costs associated with it. But the last thing that I find is really great for smart gadgets as a whole is some of those other health benefits. So measuring heart rate, one of the Apple Watches can actually measure inconsistencies in your heart rate quite well. And therefore, early on with the electrocardiogram approach, be able to know if you're going to be having a heart attack. So for my dad, for example, we made sure that when he got his Apple Watch, we made sure he got one of those. So in case of anything, that that would actually basically what it does, it would alert the authorities to come to that location. And on my Apple Watch, if I fall off my bike, which has happened once, it automatically shows a button to call emergency services because it knows you've fallen off a bike. Those
Okay.
things are really useful. But
Right. Okay.
Whoop as a concept is, I just thought I'd put that out there as well, that it's not as black and white as smart gadgets are horrible, because there are a lot of benefits as well.
Right. Okay. So those are some useful use cases, I guess, if you have a medical predisposition to
Absolutely.
having a heart problem, for example, then yes, I can see that it's a different completely different use case. And as for the Whoop topic, it would be great to get data on this. We probably should do some
Yeah.
research. If we can find some data, we'll publish it to see how the business is actually working, because I really think that they must have a very high churn of people that pay the subscription. They may pay it for 1 year, but then do they have many customers that pay $200 every year? I don't know. I don't think so. $200 for placebo, I think, is too expensive. Okay, so moving on. We've actually got some breaking news here at the moment, um, that we're filming this episode. So, as we all know, especially if you live in the US, a bill was passed in Congress last April that was signed into law, forcing ByteDance, the owner of TikTok, to divest its US TikTok operations. And after 9 months, no agreement had been reached, which meant that TikTok went dark in the US today. So we're filming this on a Sunday. But as we speak, only 12 hours after the platform momentarily discontinued its services in the US, it has now announced that it is opening up again after the Trump administration, which actually will be sworn into office tomorrow. And we should probably talk about Trump on the next episode, see how that first week went. Reached an agreement whereby Trump will issue an executive order to delay the ban, and I think that could come as soon as tomorrow. But they have already reached an agreement, so TikTok actually put the lights back on in the US. And now there's even talks of Trump bringing a deal on the table for a joint venture whereby the US would own 50% of the company. So, one of the reasons why the no agreement was reached to buy TikTok was because the algorithm, the underlying technology, which is really the valuable piece of TikTok, apart from the massive platform that it already has, was not included in the deal. ByteDance wouldn't give that proprietary technology. I think even today I read some news that Perplexity AI would be willing to purchase TikTok. Not sure about the price and what price would be accepted. It is just, Dan, so I would like to get your 2 cents of this on this topic, but it is just amazing to me the level of product market fit that TikTok has got, where it has a big chunk of the population just hooked on the platform. And even Trump wanting to keep it open on Inauguration Day. So obviously some second reasons for that as well. But at the same time, be powerful enough to raise a bipartisan security concern bill that is passed in Congress with an absolute majority. So again, we don't have all the context of what was shown, but it must have been something that congressmen were really, really concerned with. So it must have been very compelling data. But I do see how it is relevant, because just, imagine how much it could influence public opinion by just arbitrating the content that it decides to push to the audience. Just tracking what people are following, how people are engaging with different types of content, then it can get a sense of, can build a profile of a person. It really wouldn't take too much technology to do that. And so that, I understand, is a security concern for the US. I don't know, Dan, what's your view on this? Should we be also worried in Europe? We're now publishing our content on TikTok, as I hope everyone in the audience already knows. But yeah.
So, Juan, I think when it comes to TikTok and the discussed ban that's currently in progress in the US, I think it's a quite difficult thing to comprehend, because it seems very similar on the surface to some of the social media platforms that we have, right? So Instagram, we have Instagram Reels, very similar format. We have Facebook and YouTube Shorts. So on the surface, I think a lot of people might be confused as to why is it being banned? Why is such a major platform that is so influential, like you said, in discussion? There are we don't have all the information, so it's quite difficult to make a complete final kind of understanding of exactly what's going on behind the scenes. But there's a lot of discussion on spyware. There's a lot of discussion on it being a threat in terms of both economic but also social, and promoting the wrong sort of content, or the power that this company has over effectively a foreign country's education and people, because a lot of the younger generations are using these platforms as actually education resources, because they're using the medium and the content that is being provided as a source of understanding of how the world works. So the problems are multifaceted, and I think because it has a potentially political threat, it has a potentially spy threat, it's a huge problem for the US. It's not to mention the economic aspect, of course. You know, TikTok Shop is doing very well, and ideally they would like to have something like that in-house, that they have their chunk of the pie effectively. Don't get me wrong, we have a lot of like SMEs, drop shipping, a lot of influencers which use TikTok as a major platform, and a lot of them are based in the US. But
A
there's
lot
no
of businesses are really based around TikTok, and if
exactly.
today I am sure that a lot of small business owners in the US really skipped a heartbeat when they went to open their app and saw that their service was discontinued in the region, and that all that they had built over the years, their online store, for example, was not operating anymore, right? So it must have
Yeah.
been scary for some of these people, yeah, for sure.
I think one of the real questions is because arguably the strategy is a negotiation as well, right? So currently what Trump is trying to do is boost the economic profile of the US, and some of the things that he is doing, such as his discussion on invading Canada or buying Greenland, or this
Right.
whole creating a joint venture of TikTok, it's also arguably a negotiation strategy, and he's not shy of going to the extremes. It's not necessarily the case, but of course, the bill was being passed before Trump got elected and will enter office. But now these more recent developments is interesting. So that if, in theory, the US has the powers associated and the threats associated with what type of content to be pushed out, what type of information that the CIA or whoever else may be actually able to get through some of those, I think, discussions on if there's spyware through a platform like TikTok, then that's an interesting one as well to consider, because then those get eliminated and it becomes an economic injection for the US and a source of tax.
Right.
So I
Yeah.
don't I think my answer, I don't have a clear answer of what's going to happen in the EU. I think either way we should be wary, because if there's a TikTok joint venture in the US, some of those threats will not disappear. It'll just be a two-pronged threat from two different angles. And if it does get banned in the US, there will be a lot of various reasons on why exactly that has taken place, considering its impact and size. But I think you also need to think about what the US's agenda is in everything that's going on, because ideally, you could argue that economics wise, you just recreate TikTok on Instagram with the TikTok shop element, and you get rid of everybody on TikTok, and now you have another source of income. So that's also something to bear in mind. And that's where it gets really difficult, because it's a judgment piece to understand
Right.
exactly what is driving that ban. I would hope that it's mainly a security concern, but you don't know I wouldn't say I know the full understanding. I don't have the full insight of what is the ultimate objective of the ban, if you see what I
Yeah,
mean.
and there's also elements of free speech in there. I consider myself an advocate of the free market. I know that a lot of these decisions are motivated by the ultimate power play of the US and China. And is it fair that the American companies cannot operate in China, but that the Chinese companies can operate in in the US? So, that is the question here. It's actually ironic that I think I read a stat, I forgot the exact percentage, but that Duolingo experienced like a 200% increase of people trying to learn Chinese as people went to this other platform. What is it called?
Red Dot? Is it Red Dot?
Red Dot? Yeah. So essentially,
Red
people
notes. So
red note. Okay. So essentially, it's just ironic that people left TikTok to go to another Chinese provider, maybe as revenge. I don't know. Anyway, we what is clear is that we don't have all the facts here. We don't know how that data is being used by the Chinese government. You can almost be guaranteed that TikTok is feeding some of that data to the Chinese government, if not the entire thing. So yeah, there are definitely security concerns. Why don't we wrap this episode up? Unless you have some other suggest to touch on, we can go to our 2 words of the week.
I think that's perfect one. I think we've covered lovely, very interesting points this week. And I think my 2 words of the week, I'm going to keep it very simple, is dynamic friction. I think really a lot of the things we've talked about really touch on
That's a good one. That's better than mine.
of just getting started and keeping going, right? I think, we've talked about moving jobs, whatever decision you make. The important thing is to take that decision and get on with it and hope for the best and keep moving in that direction and trying not to regret or have any regrets. No matter your situation in hybrid working or if you are a decision maker, make a decision and keep going. But considering everything we've said and look online and educate yourself, I think those are some of the key ones. And TikTok and I guess security concerns and debates around platforms will continue to develop. So we just got to keep going and seeing what happens next, right? If it does get banned or if it will be reorganized to be a joint venture with the US, whatever that outcome is take that on its chin and keep going. And I think that's why, for me, dynamic friction really hits well for the entire episode and the life in general.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I 100% agree with what you said. I think that's very important as well. My 2 words of the week are going to be hybrid future, because I just feel very strongly about that discussion that we had earlier about treating employees as adults and building a foundation of trust and accountability and performance and transparency. I think the combination of those is your sweet spot that should give you your ultimate solution. And as I said, I would expect this policy to backfire on these organizations. I think it's just a matter of time. And I just think that the future is hybrid. It just now feels like an electric vehicle, like an EV advert. Anyway,
Absolutely.
I'm tired, Dan. I need to work tomorrow. I'm going to go to bed. I don't know about you.
I agree. For the listeners, thank you for listening. If you want to put your 2 words below for the week or want to add any topics you'd like us to dive into more,
or any
thank
questions,
you for listening. Or
leave
any
your questions below as well. If you have any questions that you would like us to discuss in future episodes, please leave them below as well. And thank you for listening again. See you next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.